Do you remember during COVID how PCR tests were considered the gold standard of tests? They were authoritative, and if you tested positive on a PCR test, then you were quarantined because you're a danger to society. And everyone who so much as walked past you in a shop had to be traced and tracked and notified and tested with the same gold standard PCR test. You may also remember that at the time many of us were pointing out that the creator of the PCR test, Kary Mullis, had warned that, and I quote, "Anyone can test positive for practically anything with a PCR test. If you run it long enough with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It doesn't tell you that you're sick." Now at that time in 2020 and 21, while the world had gone mad with COVID panic, you could be deplatformed for simply quoting Kary Mullis, the creator of the PCR test, and quoting his warning that a positive PCR test didn't actually mean you were sick. And of course, this was the height of the fact-checking era, and fact-checkers such as USA Today were at pains to add context to Kary Mullis's comments, as if the fact-checking interns at USA Today knew more about the subject than the creator of the PCR tests knew himself. See, Kary Mullis died in 2019, just months before his tests suddenly became the single source of truth for the entire planet, with our fate and freedom literally hanging in the balance on the results of one of his tests. Well, a new study has found that just 14% of people who tested positive in a PCR test actually got COVID-19, which means that 86% of the people who tested positive on a PCR test did not actually get the virus, or at least if they did, it was at such minuscule levels that it left no evidence in their blood, in their antibodies. And this matters because it turns out that the inventor of the PCR test, Kary Mullis, was right. The media, the fact-checkers and the government-appointed experts, well, they were wrong. Most of the panic and fear was a mirage rather than a reality, and once again, the conspiracy theorists, we were right all along. We'll dive into the details in a moment, but first, my name's Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like you to keep up with the world as it changes around you, and in this case, to stay up to date as the truth comes out about COVID. Now, why does this still matter? That was 5 years ago, wasn't it? Well, it matters because the COVID-19 panic-demic was a period of the worst human rights abuses in modern Australian history, and to date, absolutely no one has been held to account for it. And whilst some people would rather that the whole sordid chapter of Australian history simply disappeared into the past, we don't talk about the war. Personally, I believe we need to keep having these uncomfortable conversations, not so we can be stuck in the past, but to ensure that sooner or later we actually learn from the past, because the evidence suggests that we have not yet learned anything from COVID, and that history is most certainly at risk of repeating itself. I'm 100% viewer supported, so if you appreciate what I'm doing here with the Topher Project, then please support my work by buying me a coffee via the button at topherfield.net. And if you like my videos, then you will love my books, DVDs, and all my merch, which you'll find at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Don't forget that 5 of my merch designs are being discontinued forever at the end of November, which is just a few days away at the time of releasing this video. So head over to goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com and grab your favorites now while stocks last, before they are discontinued. Before we get to the results of this new study, we need to look at the confidence with which PCR testing was conducted and defended during the COVID pandemic. Fellow Victorians who lived under the Dan Andrews regime remember only too well the daily press conferences when Herr Andrews would tell us today's numbers: how many infected, how many hospitalised, how many dead. The infected number? It was purely based on these PCR tests. And if enough PCR tests were positive, we would go back into another statewide lockdown. Around the world, countries forced new arrivals to quarantine for 2 weeks and test negative on a PCR test before being allowed to roam freely. Here in Australia, we divided into states and did the same thing across our state borders. We lived and died and locked down according to what these PCR tests said. And if we as members of the public were questioning these tests, well, we were attacked. We're science deniers, conspiracy theorists, cookers. And that was true even if we quoted the creator of the PCR tests, Kary Mullis, who said, according to the USA Today fact-checking unit, anyone can test positive for practically anything with a PCR test. If you run it long enough with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It doesn't tell you that you're sick. USA Today go on to explain, while Mullis made the statement attributed to him, he was speaking about how he opposed using PCR tests to detect HIV, not COVID-19. Okay, sure, it was in the context of testing for a different thing, that's true, but the statement, anyone can test positive for practically anything, that's a pretty universal statement that is not exclusive to testing for HIV. The USA Today fact-checkers go on to claim that PCR technology has advanced since then. Well, we'll come back to that claim when we get to the results of this new study towards the end of this video. But over at fullfact.org, they were actively spreading misinformation and disinformation on their so-called fact-check of this claim about Kary Mullis. They claim that, and I quote, PCR COVID-19 tests are very sensitive, meaning that they rarely fail to detect the genetic material of the COVID-19 virus if it is present. But they're also very specific, meaning they don't often show false positives. That's an outright lie, and we knew it was a lie at the time, but now we have studies that prove it beyond doubt. But fullfact.org doubles down on their lies, cleverly concealing what sounds like a very balanced perspective. Although he wasn't talking about COVID-19 testing, it's true that PCR testing doesn't necessarily tell you that you're sick, just that the virus is present. That's true, as someone may test positive and not be showing symptoms, for example. These people may still be able to pass on COVID-19 even if they've got no symptoms. That's a lie. They bought into the asymptomatic spread lie. The truth always was that if you don't have a viral load high enough to produce symptoms, you don't have a viral load high enough to pass the virus on either. They then go on to address specifically the issue of cycles, which you can think of as amplification in a PCR test. The more cycles, the more amplification, and the more likely it is to get a positive result from a minuscule fragment of a given illness. This is essentially the crux of Kary Mullis's warning. If you over-amplify, you'll find almost anything in almost anyone. There's been persistent questions about the level of amplification or the number of cycles used for COVID-19 PCR tests. But the fact-checkers were quick to claim that 40 to 45 cycles are just fine. Let's read. The Facebook post then says PCR tests use an amplified 40 to 45 cycles, which give false positives. Medical fraud. These cycles are the number of times the replication part of the PCR process is repeated, so that the specific genetic material, if present, can be detected. The cycle threshold is the number of cycles at which the virus is detected in the sample. The maximum number of cycles done may differ between labs because of how exactly they do PCR. We've written about this several times before, but essentially cycle thresholds of 40 and 45 don't show false positives and aren't evidence of medical fraud. Public Health England says that typically a maximum of 40 cycles are conducted when testing for SARS-CoV-2, and at least one NHS trust has previously said it runs 45 cycles on its PCR tests. However, at higher cycles, PCR tests are more likely to detect people with low levels of the virus, which could indicate that they are early or late in their infection. It does not mean that the test result is invalid." End quote. Fast forward a couple of years and we can see that it was these fact-checkers who were themselves peddlers of disinformation and misinformation. And we can see that thanks to this study titled "A Calibration of Nucleic Acid by Antibody Tests in Germany, the Course of SARS-CoV-2 Infections Estimated." Essentially what they did was they compared blood tests with PCR tests at a population level. We'll get to their results in a moment, but I want to read to you a section of this study that explodes so many of the lies that we just read from these so-called fact-checkers. I quote from this study. "Studying the relationship between PCR and IgG results is crucial since PCR positive counts were widely interpreted as proxies for actual infections and served as the basis for public health policy decisions. It is therefore important to highlight two known sources of false positive PCR results. First, a study found that the Charlotte's PCR assay produced positive results on water controls at cycle threshold values between 36 and 38. Pause for a second. They found positive results for COVID-19 on water. Continue in the quote. Second, according to Bayes' theorem, the rate of false positives increases when disease prevalence declines, owing to test specificity below 100%. In addition, individuals whose PCR tests require CT values above 30 are commonly not to be considered infectious, whereas in practice, many tests were conducted with CT values up to 40 and even higher. In short, a PCR test provides a snapshot of an individual's current exposure to viral genetic material at the outermost layers of the body. End quote. All right, there's a lot in there. Essentially what they're saying is that a PCR test is testing saliva, the outermost layer of the body's immune system, and detection of COVID-19 in the saliva is not proof of infection in the blood. They make the point earlier in this study that IgA antibodies are the most prevalent in the body, and most viruses are killed before they ever reach the bloodstream, but that a PCR test will still test positive even when the virus has already been killed by the IgA antibodies in your saliva. But the key point in this paragraph is the amplification. We know from scientific tests that plain water can test positive for COVID-19 if you amplify it enough, and that above 30 cycles of amplification, a positive test loses meaning because it is no longer indicative of a real infection. In other words, they're putting into scientific terms with references the warning that Kary Mullis, to his credit, gave us back in the 1990s. PCR tests need to be used with care because they can detect almost anything in almost anybody. But here's the bombshell from this study. The correlation between positive PCR tests and positive antibody tests where people actually had an infection that their immune system had to fight inside their body, that correlation was 0.14. Let me give it to you in the study's author's own words. The value of 0.14 found for the fitted scaling parameter means that only 14% of those who were tested PCR positively actually became infected with SARS-CoV-2, end quote. To say it another way, 86% of the people who tested positive never had enough of a viral load inside their body, as distinct from in their saliva, to generate a detectable antibody response in their blood. Or to say it yet another way, as a tool for detecting COVID-19 infection, PCR tests were wrong 86 times out of every 100 positive results. At best, they were detecting exposure. These false positives, well, they were people who did have it in their saliva, so presumably they had at some point walked past someone with the virus, or maybe they'd had a conversation with someone with the virus or something along that line. But it was on the outermost layer of their body, in their saliva. They were not infected. So says the science. Now, this doesn't mean that PCR tests can never be useful. They can detect exposure. But exactly as Kary Mullis said, they're not useful for diagnosing illness. They're not useful when you amplify them too much. And if you abuse them, you can detect almost anything in almost anybody. I suggest you bookmark this video for future reference, because if there is another panicdemic, and you can bet there will be one sooner or later, we need to be able to shove this back in the faces of all of the experts and politicians who insist that they know best, especially if they insist on PCR tests as a diagnostic tool to inform their decisions. Because when a medical test is wrong 6 times more often than it is right, it's no longer a medical test. It's a Rorschach test. And people see in it whatever they're looking for. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like you to cut through the crap and make sense of the nonsense, and to keep up with the world as it changes around us. I am 100% viewer supported, so please help me to keep the Topher Project going by buying me a coffee via the button at topherfield.net. And if you like my videos, then you will love my books about government, power, human rights, and civil disobedience. There's my first book, Good People Break Bad Laws, which is all about the role of civil disobedience in the modern world. Then there's my second book, Good Christians Break Bad Laws. This is all about the theology of civil disobedience. You'll also find the DVD of my multi-award-winning documentary Battleground around Melbourne. You'll also find my t-shirts and my hoodies in a range of designs at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Now, 5 of my designs are about to be discontinued at the end of November, including my personal favourite, Too Much 1984, Not Enough 1776, and my second favourite, which I'm wearing right now, which is history saying, "Don't make me repeat myself." Along with this funky version of Good People Break Bad Laws, my Truth Will Set You Free 832 design, and Niet Zero, my way of saying no to net zero. All 5 of these are about to be discontinued, so be sure to grab the ones that you like now before they go out of stock at the end of November. Head over to goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com and remember that everything you buy will help me to keep the Topher Project going. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. The algorithm loves you, and so do I. Please like, comment, subscribe, check out this video that YouTube thinks you will also like, and as always, think free.